The mailbox is small enough to be overlooked, but it carried the only thing that kept me close to my daughter, her letters. For months, they arrived the same way. Neat, looping handwriting on thin stationery, a piece of her life folded into my hands. Then one morning, the paper was ripped, the edges chewed like an accusation. I told myself it was a one-off. Then it happened again, and again. Watching the street from my kitchen window, I felt the easy order of my neighborhood tilt toward something colder. When I finally saw Karen from the HOA at my curb, deliberate, patient, hands in motion, I understood that this was not random cruelty. What I didn't know was how I would answer. The plan I chose would expose more than a vandal. It would force a neighborhood to look at itself. Before we dive in, comment which country you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. My name is David Thompson. I work long hours and live apart from my daughter because my job keeps me on the road. The one steady thing between us is the ritual of her letters. One a week, sometimes 100 small truths tucked into a place that felt like home. She would write about a scraped knee, a book she finished, the way she learned a new joke, the small, bright things that built a life I could only visit in sentences. Those envelopes were my anchor. Our street was the kind people imagine when they picture suburbia. Trim hedges, a mailbox at each curb, polite waves that barely reached names. Karen lived 3 houses down. She chaired a chorus of titled complaints and rulebooks, the HOA president with lacquered certainty, the kind of person who could turn a neighborly tiff into a formal grievance. Both of us were white Americans, an ordinary fact that mattered only because, moments later, the wound she helped expose would be about something far less ordinary. I never expected the hostility to touch me. I had never given her a reason. Until the letters started arriving in pieces. The first torn envelope was folded and shoved back into my box, the handwriting smeared as if someone had crumpled a piece of my heart. I felt a private, hot humiliation. My daughter's news, her small joys, violated by hands I could not name. I kept quiet. Shame made secrecy comfortable, but secrecy also bred anger and a terrible sharpening of attention. I began checking the mailbox twice a day. I left no note. I collected the fragments like evidence, as if collecting shards might let me reconstruct what had been taken. The second torn letter arrived on a Thursday. I did not open my door. I watched from the draped slit and saw Karen lingering, too long, too purposeful, at my box. She moved like someone wrapping a habit around herself, like someone who believed a personal authority allowed petty cruelties. In that instant, a dozen stories crowded my mind. Was this territorial pettiness, an HOA power trip, or something uglier, something that leveled certain families as less deserving, less welcome? The question settled into my chest and would not let me go. I could either continue to bear the small violences alone or find a way to force a public accounting. I chose the latter, but not in a way that would harm another person. I wanted proof that could not be dismissed, and a way to make the neighborhood face what it had let happen. The idea formed slowly, like a lever finding its fulcrum. I would catch her on camera, but how to ensure the footage would speak louder than rumor? The answer came with a plan that would pivot everything to public eyes. The trap I built would reveal intent without inflicting injury, and it would reveal the deeper rot beneath polite lawns. Collecting myself into the work of being an ordinary man making an extraordinary choice, I treated the problem like any technical puzzle. I rigged a decoy, a mailbox identical to the rest, placed beside my real one, and set to record. The camera was small, legal, and unambiguous. Nothing meant to humiliate beyond truth. I mailed a decoy letter, sealed and stamped with a tamper-evident fold and an inked timestamp inside, a mundane little device designed to prove tampering without escalating into violence. Each step was documented. I kept careful logs. Dates, times, how the envelope looked when it arrived, what I felt when I folded the fragments into my pocket. The letters, once beyond my hands, became weight that demanded a response. I talked to 2 neighbors in private, not to gossipy ends, but to test whether anyone else had noticed patterns. One mentioned that Karen had made sharp public comments about families she considered out of place. The kind of casual xenophobia that slides off the tongues of the well-ordered when they feel the world needs guarding. Another neighbor admitted she'd seen Karen rifling through bundles of community leaflets, as if exercising ownership over the street. Neither wanted to go on record. Fear, I learned, works subtly, folding people into silence by promising social costs for speaking out. My heart ached for more than stolen paper. It ached because these letters were an act of intimacy between me and my daughter, a ritual of connection that Karen's hands saw fit to tear away. When I considered motive, another painful possibility emerged. My daughter's letters sometimes mentioned the diversity of her school and the friends she loved. Perhaps Karen's small acts were not merely about rules, but about policing who belongs. That thought made the anger taste bitter and big. I rehearsed how to present evidence so it could not be dismissed as a personal grudge. I prepared a short file: the torn fragments, the decoy letter's timestamp, the neighbor notes, the camera footage that would show a person's hands reaching into my box. I did not want a spectacle rooted in spectacle itself. I wanted accountability. I reached out to the postal inspector's office and filed a formal complaint, documentary steps that would give weight to whatever the camera captured. I spoke to the HOA manager, not expecting quick justice, but wanting an official record. Then I waited, because evidence needs moments to breathe before it becomes undeniable. Each day of waiting tightened the air in my chest, and each night I reread old letters until their words blurred and steadied my resolve. The camera recorded for a week with nothing dramatic: mail carriers, a jogger, leaves skittering like tiny conspiracies. Then it caught a shadow that was all too human. Karen's profile leaning into the frame, fingers strafing the flap of the mailbox. The footage was small and monstrous at once: deliberate motion, a furtive glance over the shoulder, and a hand tucking a letter away. The timestamp matched the decoy seal. I watched the clip alone in my kitchen and felt a strange combination of triumph and dread, as if catching the act had moved the harm into a new space where it could be judged. I uploaded the footage to a secure file and sent copies to the postal inspector and to a lawyer who advised me on harassment and tampering statutes. I also prepared a short factual packet for the HOA meeting that was coming up, the place where neighbors habitually negotiated the small terms of communal life. The meeting, I knew, would be the crucible. I had to decide whether to make it public there or to release it online first. Either way, truth would have an audience now. The only question that remained was how the neighborhood would choose to see what it had let happen. The night before the HOA meeting, I sat with the last letter my daughter had sent. An ordinary page about a bird she'd named that would not sit still. It felt unbearably tender in my hands. I rehearsed my words in silence: concise, factual, impossible to smear as vendetta. The morning of the meeting, the room smelled of stale coffee and fluorescent light. Neighbors filled folding chairs in polite expectation. Karen entered with the practiced composure of someone used to steering narratives. I requested to present my packet. The room shifted to attention. I played the footage on a borrowed projector. The image was nothing dramatic. It was painfully domestic: a woman's silhouette, a hand, an envelope snatched away. The screen did not scream, it simply showed what had been happening in a place where people assumed civility. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the packet of documentation, timestamps, the tamper evidence seal that had been broken, my logged reports to the postal inspector became a cornered mirror. Some neighbors looked surprised, some looked away, and a few began to murmur the words that always come when small cruelties are finally named. I didn't know. Karen's face did not contort into fury so much as go hard with measured indignation. She objected, of course, her voice practiced and precise, but the footage, the paper, the chain of custody made rebuttal thin. What followed was not a dramatic public shaming, but the slower process of institutional reckoning. The HOA formed a committee to investigate tampering complaints. The postal inspector scheduled a formal inquiry. Several neighbors, having seen the footage, offered statements and corroboration. The lawyer advised filing a trespass and tampering complaint. I did. In the lull between accusation and resolution, a different thing happened. Conversations began in the margins. People who had never before spoken about race or belonging in our enclave found themselves asking small but piercing questions. Whom do we exclude when we call something orderly? Whose presence here do we believe threatens us? Karen denied a racial motive, and perhaps in her mind the acts were about control rather than race. But the pattern of her comments and the context of her actions created a map that led outwards to a community choice about who deserves civility and whose communications can be shredded without consequence. The legal process moved slowly, but the social process, neighbors reconsidering what they had tolerated, accelerated with blunt, awkward honesty. That was the point at which the neighborhood felt most changed, when civility could no longer be an unexamined shield for small violences. Months later, the postal inspector closed the file with a finding that supported my complaint, and the HOA imposed sanctions against behaviors that targeted residents' privacy. Karen was required to attend mediation and to issue a written apology. She did so with the formal language of someone who had been taught to measure remorse. To some, the outcome would have looked small: papers and signatures, a fine, the mechanics of accountability. To me, it was larger: a public acknowledgement that my daughter's letters mattered, that the private bonds between a father and a child were not trivial enough to be torn away with impunity. The neighborhood changed in subtler ways too. Parents started a community mailbox watch, not the police, but to protect. A few homeowners who had previously avoided uncomfortable conversations began hosting potlucks that welcomed the different families on our street. The conversations were messy and incomplete, full of apologies that stumbled and defenses that hardened and then softened, but they were happening. My daughter continued to write, sometimes longer now, as if sensing that our small ritual had been defended. The letters came whole more often than not. What lingered was a quieter lesson about vigilance and responsibility. It would have been easier to set the incident aside, to pretend torn paper was a local nuisance rather than a symptom. It would have been easier to live with the small injustices that fall like crumbs from the table of normal life. Instead, a decision to document and present the harm made our community answer for itself. We were forced to consider whether civility was merely a polished surface or a shared commitment that required repair. When I fold the letters now, the paper still trembles in my hands, but less from fear and more from gratitude. The mailbox sits where it always did, ordinary and small, but it feels like a guarded place, not because walls are higher, but because people have been asked to notice. If a single envelope can be a tether between two people who are often apart, what does that say about the duties we owe each other in the neighborhoods we call home?